Welcome to What Is It About the Weather? I'm your host, Mark Jelinek, and this is the weekly podcast where we talk all things weather, but not so much about the weather itself. I know that my weather intertwined world, well, you can probably still hear a little bit in my nose. We're definitely in pollen season in my living vicinity, and I laugh a little bit about the matrix that they throw up about, low, medium, high stuff. And I guess that matters certain times of the year. We have a threshold, at least with our measurements, that it gets above the number's 1,500. I'm not going to get into what all that means, but if it gets above that, it's just high. And we go through these days that, just blow that number out of the water. But today we're slightly below that threshold, and I don't know that it'll make any difference whatsoever. You can probably tell I'm still feeling a little nasally. I don't suffer bad from allergies, but, enough that I notice it in my sinuses this time of year. Hopefully, if you're dealing with those things, it's not too bad for you. I don't know, it's definitely one of those things that for some people can be a ruiner of a season for sure. So we'll get through this nasally podcast. Hopefully it won't be too bad in a couple more weeks. And again, weather, this time of year, the part that's always interesting is watching how rain comes and clears it out. But that same rain encourages the blooming of new plants and flowers. And so it's just kind of a vicious cycle. I hope you've had an enjoyable, intertwined weather world over the last week. I mentioned the pollen, but I, as always, have maybe a more intertwined weather world than other people just because of the nature of what I do, but had a few interesting things, I guess, that stood out this past week besides the pollen. I had a chance to be back on Weather Brains again. This time we actually talked briefly about what I was supposed to talk about the first time around a little over a week ago, and that had to do with verification of those longer range forecasts that I was keeping track of for my area. So I will put in the show notes a link to the episode, so if you want to catch that, it's really towards the end I talk about, but it's actually a really neat episode. They had a guest on who does modeling of tornadoes. It's a very interesting conversation about the work that he's doing and the potential it has to really help our understanding of something that happens at a much smaller scale than so much of the meteorology that we think about in the world and the weather we think about in the world. But it prompted me to think, at some point, and maybe I'll do it in May, do some sort of, how to grade your meteorologist episode. We've talked a lot about statistics and, verification and those things, but maybe translating that down into grading the people you use to get your weather information from, whether it's an app on your phone or whether it's a broadcast meteorologist or whoever it is. And there's some simple things you can really do to gauge that. And you don't have to work that hard at it. There's plenty of easily and readily available data. Actually, the producers of the forecast are the ones that you probably have to keep more of an eye on. Getting the actual statistics of what happened, that's for the most part a very simple process, and it can be done. I don't care whether you're in the U.S., it's particularly easy, and I'm sure it is in some other countries, but around the globe, that data is available to you. So just something to keep in mind, and like I said, we'll probably do a future episode on that since I've been in verification mode lately. The other big thing here in the Southeast, we had some really, in my location, the storms didn't end up being that bad, but in the vicinity, we had some really impressive, spring-like severe weather last Wednesday. And actually, there was concerns about tornadoes now down south of where I am, by a few hundred miles / kilometers. We had some tornadoes that were involved. But in my area, the weather didn't turn out to be all that bad. And again, there's some reasonings behind that we're not going to get into on this podcast. But the long and the short of it is, many of you know, Atlanta is the major hub for Delta Airlines. And because of the weather around the area and what was believed was going to be part of the area, because again, a plane doesn't just land on Atlanta, it has to fly through all this stuff. So there were numerous cancellations, and this impacted Delta's flight schedule for days. And I've read stories about people being paid. This story keeps showing up in my news feed, and it's probably because I looked at it. That drives me nuts. Never mind. Different topic. But a family was paid $11,000 not to fly. Yeah, that's not a bad deal if you can work that out, of course. Hopefully they were still able to do some sort of vacation, which is what I'm assuming they were going to do. But this is a reminder of how weather sensitive so many things that we do are, and increasingly so, because as we push the envelope in things that we do, I don't know, even 20 years ago, I flew for business on a fairly regular basis every couple of weeks. And it was just very different than it is today, particularly during the week. So much of the flying was purely just business travelers. And yeah, you had some weekend travel, but it just wasn't to where it is now. Now so much of the travel that's done on airplanes are people going on vacations or just going to see a family member, but it doesn't necessarily have to be business anymore. And that's really changed and put pressure on the system in ways that it maybe didn't in the past, but it just, with more people flying and flying being so sensitive to these types of weather outbreaks or winter storms or whatever it is, it's just a reminder of how intertwined all that is. And it certainly, I watched this happen. I mean, family members who I had flying in and out of Atlanta last week were impacted in a major way. Other people I know who were going, I have a friend who, somebody I used to work for that was going up to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to see Yes, and even days later, their flight schedules were impacted by everything that was going on with Delta. And of course, just, watching, like I said, these stories of people being paid not to fly, etc. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. Just a few hours of storms and the days of ramifications that led to. So pretty interesting stuff, although you may not find it all that interesting. So enough. Let's get on to our main topic for the day. So this week, now, I was looking back as to when we did the umbrella episode. It's hard for me. I kept looking and I was like, where's that episode? And it's way back in the list. It was last October that we got into this ancient tech, right? Something as simple as the umbrella. And we did bring it forward to modern times, but really the focus was this old thing that had been around for a long time. Because at some point, while it got better, it still reached a limit. Then on the flip side of that, we've talked modern tech. So this time we're going to do tech that really goes back probably even further than the umbrella, but bring it into the modern day and where we are now with it. And this all stems around the idea of how do we keep dry, right? When it's raining, or when that rain turns into a raging river, how do we keep dry? Now, in the mix of all that, you're going to get the how do we keep dry when you're in a boat sort of thing, because that's water too. I get that. But the idea really is whether it's precipitation when it's happening or it's precipitation after the fact, and that could be snow melt or just an over deluge of rain that leads to flooding. Fundamentally, most people, like, I've said this before, I'm fine with getting wet. I enjoy it. It makes me kind of feel alive to have that sensation. Now, flooding's a different thing. No one likes to be in flooding because, the other thing with flooding is it tends to bring up the muck that no one wants to be in. And actually, we had some flooding in Atlanta, and the E. coli in the local river, it shot through the roof. And it's just like, people are like, don't go to the river. And I was driving over the bridge of the river that day and watched someone fishing in the water. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know that you want to be out there in that. Now, I couldn't see if they had waders on or that sort of thing to keep themselves dry. Hopefully they did. But I'm still thinking to myself, I'm not sure I even would want to eat a fish that's been swimming around in that kind of stuff. Any case, I digress. So this is not a new problem by any means. Like I said, the research I found, and as always with this kind of stuff, this was not one of those where I went into a lot of peer-reviewed papers and looked at the history, because a lot of this stuff, I'm not sure you could accurately say the history, but it's clear. It's clear that we've been trying to keep things dry based on, artifacts that have been found for, let's say, on the order of 15,000 years, maybe not quite that long, but older stuff we found seems to indicate that. So it's not a new problem. And we know the obvious ways, and people have probably been doing it longer than that. Hide under something, right? A cave. If you always hear these stories about cavemen. I don't know. Where I live, there's just not that many caves, so I'm not sure where they lived when they weren't in a cave. Any case, you hide under a ledge, whatever it might be, that moves the water away. And there are plenty of these types of things that exist in nature, right? On the flip side of that, there's other things that we might use for a short rain, like standing under a tree or some other sort of natural growing scenario that gives us some protection. But as we all know, usually over time, those begin to fail. Water finds its way through, it weaves its way through, and then once it does, it seems like it doesn't stop. And that can be the case. Even after the rain stops, water may keep dripping in that source. But one of the things I found interesting is, in terms of research, some of the oldest artifacts that have been found focused on how we were trying to keep food dry, which is interesting when you think about it, right? There's this catch-22. You need good rain, properly timed rain, to have optimal crops. Yet too much rain at the wrong time, even during the growing, but this was really focused on after the fact, after you harvest. If things got wet, it quickly can lead to rot. And if you're trying to store food, and this was the case as we went more into an agrarian style of living, we tended to store grains in particular. Grains could store for a long time, and there were two things that were not good for them. One was certain insects, right, that we get in, and anybody that's ever had those things that get into grains and end up in your pantry. I haven't had them in the U.S. before, but we had it when I was down in Chile, and man, one, you just want to throw everything away because you don't know what it's gotten into, but man, once it's in there, once you get those moths going and hatching, and then you know that there's little crawly things rolling around that are leading to those moths, you just really don't want to eat any of that stuff. But that was one thing. The other was rain, right? Getting the grain wet and ruining the crop. So for a very long time, we've been trying to figure out how to protect grain, and that was the interesting thing. Some of the artifacts that were found were not just about when you're storing it in the end, but even when you were collecting the grains, protecting the basket so moisture didn't get to the grain even as it was being put into the collection basket. And by far, the number one tool or technique or approach that we used, the most effective approach that's been found over a long time, was something, now you may know it by different names, but bitumen is how some people pronounce it. It's technically bitumen, I think, is the pronunciation that's the official one, but bitumen is the way I've heard it before. That's apparently more of a UK kind of pronunciation, but maybe it just flows off the tongue a little better than bitumen. And some of you may never have heard this word. Some of you, what in the world is that? Well, most people will know it as asphalt. Some people will have heard it called pitch. All these terms are used in an interrelated way, but they're not necessarily exactly the same thing. Now, this material can occur naturally, right? And it can also, and what most of us know it as, is something that's a byproduct of petroleum, okay, which gives us a chance to go in and make this material, essentially, that so many of us think of as for roads, right? I'm back. Some of you may not even know I went away, but I was actually dealing with a waterproofing incident. As odd as that sounds. And excuse me if I end up repeating myself on anything, but I had a call from the Southern Hemisphere about dealing with a leaky sink. So, problem averted, solved, actually. It's kind of something that I knew was going to come up at some point, but didn't expect waterproofing to come up right in my waterproofing podcast. So where was I? I was talking about bitumen, or bitumen, as some of you may know it, or asphalt, or pitch. I mean, it takes on all these names, right? What's interesting about this material is it's what we call viscoelastic polymer. All right, I know that's a fancy name, but generally what it means is in its natural state at normal temperatures, it behaves like a solid. However, over time, very long time, it actually flows. And you can imagine it if you've ever been on, if you've maybe even seen pictures. There's some airports here in the U.S. I know Dallas is one I've seen pictures of before, where it's not the runway itself, but the taxiway gets real hot, and so hot that it starts to lose its form, and planes actually sink into it if they sat too long in a specific position. Not if they're just rolling along, but if it sits too long. And you may have seen it before, where you've seen pictures of kind of asphalt molding or taking shape. Now, if you heat it up a lot, you can continue to change the properties of it, right? Not a big surprise. We think about water as being our classic example. It can be in a vapor form, a liquid form, or a solid form. What we don't think of with water is it being in that kind of in-between state, like this can be. So even when it's in a solid state, it's still not completely solid. Now, if you cooled it down enough, you could probably, and I'm sure it did, I didn't read into this, you could get rid of that elastic element to it, but it would also probably become more brittle. So there's trade-offs there. So kind of at room temperature, if you will, or natural temperatures, it has this slowly moving behavior. But as I mentioned, kind of the interesting thing about it is it occurs naturally as well. And in some areas more than others, areas of Canada, areas of Southeast Asia, where there are deposits of this naturally occurring setup. And that's most likely how we first learned to use it, or first learned about its properties. But the whole idea, right, is most of the cases we're trying to keep water out, all right, of something. So we are trying to do this waterproofing with it. We want to keep it out. This initially used more after the fact, but even in storing materials, we used it in a way that would hopefully keep things dry once, for instance, a crop was harvested if new rain occurred. But in a lot of cases, and again, this isn't surprising. I mean, you think about the classical uses of this stuff, right? We talked about that food case above in ancient times. But you really hear about it more in construction, and actually this stuff is still very commonly used today in asphalt roofs, right, and roofing tiles and tar paper and all that stuff. It's all made of the same material. This and derivatives thereof have been used to waterproof boats for millennia as well. So, we think about it on these grand scales, but what you really don't think about, and the thing that we still seem to be missing here, and maybe the whole idea of what we're trying to do is, how do we keep people dry, right? So we had this material that had been around for a long time, and people used it in a variety of ways, and I'm sure, actually, they used it to coat things, right? Maybe some clothing or something, special clothing. But it doesn't breathe real well. Really, the first material, one that we used in materials when we started creating, let's make this transition now to more waterproof clothing, was probably rubber. And that happened, when we really started to infuse rubber, or even make rubber layers that could keep us dry, started in the kind of the 1800s. And then we would think about different resins and how we could apply resins into things. And resin really is just a plant-based version of bitumen, okay, or bitumen, whichever you want to say. And of course, then in kind of the 1960s, we started what I would call the chemical explosion. It's kind of post-World War II. And we were making new discoveries all the time about new chemicals that, we could create all sorts of surfaces with. And everything kind of changed then in how we think about it. But stepping back to the people for a moment, I talked about how the focus was on these large things and using bitumen or bitumen. But people actually have been waterproofing themselves for a long time. And interestingly, where we started with those things, and I'll put a link in the show notes to a great article that was written about it. There's this classic coat, and I don't know if it was preserved or if someone made a new one, that was made out of, you guessed it, intestines. So intestines and skins is where we as people really started, even before there was, the kind of the rubber phase. We kind of recognized, hey, our guts, animals' guts work like our guts. They got to keep moisture in as it flows through our body. But at the same time, nutrients need to be absorbed. So there was this kind of appreciation and understanding somehow that one way would protect us from too much water getting in, or in concept out, yet at the same time be permeable enough to where it didn't become non-breathable. Then we evolved into more working things into fabrics, okay, and rubber being one of those, right, in some ways, but not necessarily as a layer, but more is just its existence, treating it almost like, pitch or bitumen, kind of weaving it into stuff. Grasses and leaves, we've learned very quickly about the runoff capability of those, and you even see, and you've probably seen it in a movie you've seen before, someone gets lost and they cover themselves with some sort of leaf-infused clothing. Now, part of that is, yes, we were protecting, and so you couldn't show nudity on the air or whatever, but part of it is that repelled water. And so there were real cases where people did this for real need. The other piece was oils, right? We learned very quickly oil and water don't mix. So working oils into fabrics, and we still do this today. We treat, when I was growing up and doing any sort of outdoor things, we would treat surfaces with a chemical, an oil-like chemical that would repel. Now, over time, that would break down and you'd have to retreat or whatever. But the whole idea is it causes water to bead up and move along, right? And all these things work really well when water is rolling, not so well when water's sitting. And, of course, within all this, we had the natural components, like fabric like wool, or even certain types of cotton, that naturally sort of repel water, just like they do for the animals. Kind of like feathers, right? All these things. Animals have these natural water deterrents built in. And quite frankly, our skin works pretty well at it, but then you feel wet. That's why we don't like it, right? But probably the game changer was when we took rubber and made a true layer out of it, and that would really keep you dry, straight up. Okay, the Macintosh raincoat is the one that was kind of the big thing that happened, but there was a fundamental problem with that, and as nice as that was, it didn't breathe. And anybody who's ever worn a true like rubberized raincoat, one of those nice bright yellow ones or whatever, they work really well for a short period of time, but if it's warm at all, you get hot and it becomes unbearable. So then we would go back to these fabric things. So Burberry is classic for gabardine fabric. And essentially this was doing the same thing with taking a fabric, a very tightly woven fabric, and with the oil component to it, okay, or the natural oils in the fabric, created kind of this water. Again, water would roll off, but any water that sat for a very long period of time could still soak in. But again, the difference here was it would let your natural, if you were sweating or whatever, breathe. So your vapor waters, and this is the idea, is the way it was woven was such that any water that was in liquid form would not permeate the surface. But in vapor form, so your sweat before it became, like when it was just more in a vapor state, or anything that was permeating off your skin in a vapor state could still move through the fabric. And the idea there is you just didn't get overheated. That's not to say you didn't sweat underneath the thing and that didn't go through the surface either. But there was less of that, right? And probably the final step, and this is really where we are today, was the invention of Gore-Tex. And the idea here, and Gore-Tex is a trademark name, and I didn't read into all the development of Gore-Tex and everything, but it's kind of recognized as this is the leap we made. This was post the chemical revolution. This was post, we can make all these polymers and do everything ourselves. Gore-Tex really did something that was trying to balance all these different elements. So you had an outer layer that looked fancy, looked nice, but was probably built to like brush against things and could handle, a little outside wear and tear, because that was always part of the problem with some of these other fabrics is they weren't rugged enough. Okay, so the gabardine fabric was good, but it wasn't really rugged enough to handle the situations you might get into. Whereas the Macintosh raincoat was strong enough to handle being outdoors, but you couldn't really be active in it. So we needed that balance. So that's really what Gore-Tex brought us. And it's really kind of a 3-layer process. You got this outer layer that is, stand up to the elements, not just the water, but the elements in general, and that could be UV in different things. And again, not to say that it hasn't evolved, so we water treat even those so that water more easily rolls off that layer, or it might have UV protection or whatever it is. Then there's the middle layer that is that mesh layer that deals with the water in 2 ways. Keep water out, but allow water vapor from your skin to go through. And then on the inside, you would have another layer, because you don't want your skin rubbing up against a polymer mesh of some kind, right? It's not very comfortable. So you would take and add, you could add a lot of things. I mean, you might have a nice soft fleecy inside or whatever it is, but generally speaking, you had a softer side that would sit against the skin. Right. And that's still kind of the industry standard today. Now, I've read some articles, and even one that I'll put a link to in the show notes, where they were hyping some new evolution of material that's going to kind of weave all those things into one layer. Well, it's still 3 layers in my mind. I don't know that it's drastically different. They may have made it thinner or lighter or whatever it is. And that's still a good thing. Don't get me wrong. Because anybody that's worn kind of ski clothing, let's say, or anything that's designed to be waterproof, that it can still be a little heavy, even with the Gore-Tex. And so anything you can do to lighten that up and make it effective, those are all good things, right? But that's how we keep dry as people today, really. 3 layers. One that protects, one that transports moisture in both ways, and then one that's nice on the skin. Who'd have thought it was so simple? Now, any of you that's ever worn some of those materials know that if you let it stand for too long and like it's rained on you, but the water kind of breaks down into smaller and smaller droplets, there's some stuff like, golf wear fits in this category, where I could be out in it and it can keep me dry as it's raining. But as I go about doing things, if I don't take that shell off, as it is, that as the water gets into smaller and smaller droplets, it eventually works its way through and can get your inner clothes wet. So just keep in mind that these things that are truly, waterproof, and there are different ways that we measure that, by the way. There are even standards that we use for that. Each of them has pros and cons. But if you really want to never see water, you're going to probably have to give up the breathable aspect. But if you're willing to let it breathe a little bit, some water might get through. Just keep in mind that you want to, after the rain stops, if you're in a heavy rain, kind of shake off to make sure that the fabric doesn't stay moist. History of waterproofing. Who knew? It all had to do with asphalt. Any case, all right, so interesting tidbit is related to this, and I'll put a link in the show notes. I mentioned how bitumen is a, or pitch, or whatever you want to call it, is a viscoelastic polymer. And essentially what this means is eventually it moves. And there's an interesting scientific experiment that's been going on for years. I think it's in the UK, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm pretty sure of that. It could be in Canada. I think it's UK, though. I should pull up the link while I'm even looking at this so that I can make sure that I'm telling you exactly the right thing. And while I'm pulling this up, the University of Queen... Oh, it's in Australia. I stand corrected, and I should make sure that I get that right. So I was right with my UK, pronunciation maybe, but it happens in Australia. And for years, they have been tracking this bit of pitch, and it does drops. It's been going on for 86 years, and so far there have been 9 drops of this material, and it's wild watching it because basically what happens at first, it looks like almost like a raindrop just sitting there hanging. Of course, it's black, but then it stretches out and it gets this real long thing, and then eventually it'll drop off. And you can literally watch live, if you're so inclined, how this happens. And trust me, it takes a very, very long time to happen, on the order of years. So you're not going to probably catch it anytime soon, but again, they have a live feed of it. So it's kind of a neat thing. Again, I'll put that in the show notes, and you can read more about the whole process and the experiment if you want to as well. All right, with that, I guess it's time to wrap up. As you heard me, I'm going to probably do a grading a meteorologist sometime in May, but we got bugs and energy to still deal with this month. Do I have 2 more podcasts? Yeah, I should have 2 more podcasts this month. So keep an eye out for that. I'm going to get back into alert apps, and as I think I mentioned, dealing with like weather information for the visually impaired. So after hearing from a listener about that. So all things coming up in the near future. All right. You know how to get hold of the podcast if you want to reach me. Show ideas, thoughts, suggestions, whatever it might be. Email, simple way. whatisitabouttheweather@gmail.com. Website, whatisitabouttheweather.com. Go there, use the contact form, either way. And also while you're there, you'll find, different ways to connect with us. Social media, right? As I mentioned, I've added the show to Facebook. I'm slowly working on that. Again, it's just another thing. And me being the juggling one-man show I am, sometimes it can get hard to juggle in all these places. And yes, I know there are tools that can allow me to post something in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram all at the same time, all that kind of stuff. But I don't find that any of those 3 social media platforms interact the same way. So posting one thing to all 3 doesn't really work for me. So just be patient. I'm trying different things in different places, but feel free to engage us on any of those platforms, whether it's the show itself, and you can usually use the abbreviation. If you search Facebook or Twitter on WIIATW, what is it about the weather, you will find it there. Or you can get me, Mark_Jelinek, JELINEK, on Twitter, and let's see, Instagram, use those abbreviations. I think my LinkedIn and Facebook stuff's a little different, although I'm not doing as much on those 2 platforms as, again, dividing time in different places. But you can catch me on all those things. And lastly, of course, thanks to all those of you who support the podcast, that have done it financially through Patreon or PayPal. Both options are on the website, whatisitabouttheweather.com/support. But you know the method: RSVP, rate, share, validate, and pledge. All 4 of those mechanisms are extremely important to the discoverability, the viability, the interest ability of the podcast and how we move forward. So however you do it, it is greatly appreciated. And as always, and until next time, I hope you have an enjoyable and intertwined weather world, because as we all know, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.